Dr. Mark David Hall is professor in Regent University's Robertson School of Government and director of the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy's Religious Liberty in the States. He earned a BA in Political Science from Wheaton College and a PhD in Government from the University of Virginia. He has written, edited, or co-edited 15 books, including Did America Have a Christian Founding? Separating Modern Myth from Historical Truth.
So I'm going to give a talk based on a chapter in a recent book. The book is Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land. And similarly, I'm going to have to just touch on a few highlights. I have a talk I usually give in about 50 minutes, and I have 20 minutes, and we have a very stickler of a timekeeper here. So I'll just say a few things. You can go look at that book. In the book, I have a chapter on opposition to slavery in the founding era, and then a separate chapter on the abolitionist movement. The title of the book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, of course, that's a verse from the Bible, from Leviticus. It's inscribed on the Liberty Bell. But I tend to like another story. Sojourner Truth, the great abolitionist, used to go around after she had escaped freedom, and she would hang a banner with this verse on it, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land. And first she would preach the gospel to enable people to be free of their sins. But then she would preach against the sins of the people, that is primarily slavery, right? And try to encourage her fellow Americans to end this evil, horrible practice. And so what I say might sound like the Pollyannish side of things. I always make it crystal clear. Slavery is a grave moral evil. It was grave moral evil. It still is a grave moral evil. People estimate that there might be 46 million people held in slavery today throughout the world. And so we shouldn't pretend this was just something that went on way back then. But I also try to provide some context, because I find that my students tend to think, well, all of the founders owned slaves, and they didn't really care about slavery. They were just a bunch of hypocrites. They said nice words about liberty and equality in the Declaration, but they owned slaves and they didn't care. And I try to complicate that a little bit. One of the first things I do, I have a nice little graph that I oftentimes will put up, and this just blows. I should have brought it or brought a paper with it on, but it really is just striking. It blows my students away. So there's something, I'll give you the exact figure, 12.5 million Africans that were stolen from Africa and brought to the New World. Of these 12.5 million Africans, only 3.2% came to British North America. All the rest went to South America or the Caribbean. And that just in and of itself kind of blows my students away. I think they just assume all the slaves came to North America, and it was in America that we had slavery and everywhere else not so much. But just to try to first of all emphasize, look, slavery is something that has gone on throughout the world, throughout pretty much everywhere, every time, every place. And what really is kind of distinctive in the American context is the opposition to slavery that arose at the highest levels. And you can trace this back to the Puritans. The first anti-slavery tract was written in 1700. Massachusetts Bay banned slavery except in the case of captives taken in a just war. Now, unfortunately, they kind of loosened that, and you do have slavery, of course, throughout the colonies. By the time we get to the American founding, one of the things I like to do is just run through a couple of categories of founders. And I think what I want to do is focus on the founders who didn't own slaves, but also the founders who owned slaves and freed them. And I'll mention them, and I'll probably be a little loose with the facts, but you can go to the book if you want the exact fact. It is pretty striking, the number of founders who at one point owned slaves and then decided this is a horrific institution. I cannot participate in this. Someone like Ben Franklin, for instance, owned 5 slaves, 5 enslaved persons throughout his lifetime. Toward the end of his life, he recognized that this is a horrible institution. He freed the last of them, eventually became president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, and this society, of course, famously petitioned Congress to end slavery. John Dickinson, at one point the largest slave owner in Delaware, he decided that he couldn't participate in this institution. So he set up a legal instrument to gradually manumit his slaves, to gradually free his slaves. But then he kind of started thinking about, wait a minute, if slavery is wrong, what am I doing gradually ending it? And so eventually he just simply freed freed them all. You have several other founders that fall into this category. John Jay, at one point owned several enslaved persons, eventually freed them, became head of the New York Abolitionist Society, and worked to get a law passed in that state ending slavery. Let's see, let me shift to talk about founders who never owned slaves. Again, I think sometimes students don't even think about this. There's founders that they just weren't touched by this. One of my favorite founders is Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a really neat guy, intimately involved in almost every document that we have coming out of the era, on the 5-person committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, involved in the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Resolves, and so forth and so on. He never owned an enslaved person. 1783, he is invited to revise all of Connecticut's laws. The libertarian side of me loves this. When you go back to the founding era, you can get the state's codes, the colonial codes and the state codes, they're all in one volume. There's just one volume, and they're organized alphabetically, so you can go and easily find the sort of law you're looking for. Well, he had a chance to revise Connecticut statutes in 1783, working with a guy named Richard Law. This is going on everywhere, and it's kind of striking. Again, most people just think about Thomas Jefferson revising the Virginia statutes, the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and that deserves to be known, of course. It's a very important document. Roger Sherman has a religious liberty provision as well, a Connecticut statute for religious liberty. And for the life of me, I'm not sure why we don't consider that statute as well as the other statutes from the other states. Virginia is very important. Thomas Jefferson is very important. But all the states are engaged in this endeavor, and we should consider the religious liberty statutes from other states. More interesting for this talk, though, Sherman also came up with the gradual manumission statute, which was passed and implemented in Connecticut, that put slavery on the road to extinction in Connecticut. And we can, of course, object, well, why on the road to extinction? Why not just abolish it? And of course, I wish it had been abolished in every state right away. Of course, politics is the art of the possible, and what he thought he could do was put slavery on the road to extinction, and so he was able to do that. Again, I want to emphasize never owned an enslaved person. John Adams of Massachusetts, never owned an enslaved person, drafted the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, which has some wonderful language about liberty and equality. And several enslaved people said, wait a minute, this sounds like slavery is incompatible with the Massachusetts Constitution. An enslaved person, Quock Walker, brought a suit, and in the Massachusetts Superior Court said, yeah, that's right. Slavery is abolished, 1782 in Massachusetts, right? And so you have this movement that is going on that I think we oftentimes neglect. We could talk about a few other of these folks, but I think I'll move on to the folks who actually owned slaves. Many of them, of course, very troubled by it. George Washington freeing the slaves he could free in his will and so forth. And almost everyone has negative things to say about slavery. I'll give you a few examples of this and in ways in which it cashes out. Let me shift to some of the key documents coming out of this era. The Declaration of Independence, and we're celebrating its 250th anniversary, of course, with these wonderful words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And again, it's oftentimes my students come in just assuming, well, this is just hypocritical. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and of course he did own slaves. He actually did a lot to try to eliminate slavery, to end slavery in America, not enough. But you also have on the 5-person committee a Roger Sherman and a John Adams, right? Founders who never owned enslaved persons who contribute to these words. You have an African-American minister in the same year that the Declaration of Independence was passed who wrote an anti-slavery pamphlet, and he quotes these words, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So people are taking this as a promise that is relevant to slavery. Thomas Jefferson, of course, famously decried slavery in the Notes on the State of Virginia and elsewhere. And so I would just submit to you that I think the Declaration of Independence is too quickly glossed over. It is seen at the time as being incompatible with slavery, and people start acting upon this. Let me shift to the Constitution. One of the fun things to do, I'm sure you all have done this as teachers, is read through the Madison's notes of the debates in Philadelphia. And a tracked this pretty rigorously in my chapter on the founders and slavery. Pretty much everyone in the convention that said anything about slavery said it's a horrible institution. Even the people who owned slaves say it's a horrible thing, we have to do it. James Madison points out that they don't include the word slave or slavery or any of its cognates in the Constitution because they don't want to admit that it's possible to own people. Of course, there's 3 provisions of the Constitution that touch on slavery, the 3/5 Compromise and so forth. But what is interesting, and this was a story I came across a couple years ago, it just kind of blew me away. So everyone's saying all sorts of negative things about slavery, and there's questions, what can we do about it? You have some of the delegates from the Deep South saying, if you touch slavery, we're out of here. So a constitution that bans slavery probably is not a realistic option. Midway through the summer of 1787, you have 3 delegates to the Constitutional Convention who leave Philadelphia and go to New York City, where they vote to approve the Northwest Ordinance, approved by the Confederation Congress in the summer of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance, of course, banned slavery in the Old Northwest. Those, the territory that would become the states of Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, part of Minnesota. One of these delegates came back from New York City to Philadelphia, where he informed the fellow delegates of the Northwest Ordinance. And this, I think, reinforced what several of the delegates said, including Roger Sherman, who's right there. Basically, he said slavery is on the way out. We don't need to resolve it right here in Philadelphia. It's disappearing. Remember, Roger Sherman had written a gradual manumission statute. Massachusetts had banned it. Several other states are moving in this direction. We're banning slavery in the Northwest Territory. It's on its way out. No one in the founding era is defending slavery as a positive good. That wouldn't come until 1820, right? Everyone recognizes this is an evil that has to be dealt with. There's a real optimism that it's disappearing. I'll jump to the end of the chapter just to make sure I get there, because we all know it didn't disappear, especially in the South. Eli Whitney and the cotton gin ruined everything, right? By inventing the cotton gin, which permits the easy separation of cotton fibers of, I think it's short staple cotton, which can grow in the interior of the American South. It makes it profitable, right? 1792, 1793, which really did give slavery a lease on life in the American South. Now, the cotton gin saves a lot of labor, but you still need a lot of work to clear the land, to harvest the cotton, this sort of thing. And so slavery gets a new lease on life in the American South, and eventually you have John C. Calhoun and others defending it as a positive good in the 1820s. But I think this Northwest Ordinance gave a lot of people a lot of hope that slavery is on its way out. Let me shift to the, I think the more important story, and then I will, I think, stop with that so we have plenty of time for Q&A. Again, I've already alluded to this several times. A number of my students have no idea that slavery was under direct assault in many states. In fact, many states either ended it directly or put it on the road to extinction. I'll just read the states and the dates. Vermont, 1777, Massachusetts, 1780, Pennsylvania, 1780, New Hampshire, 1783, Rhode Island, 1784, Connecticut, 1784, New York, 1799, New Jersey, 1804. So now slavery is never as important up north as it is in the South, and certainly as it became in the South, but still these acts freed more than 100,000 enslaved persons. And as a political scientist, we're kind of trained to think in terms of self-interest, but it's kind of interesting to think, what is the interest of these legislatures? What is the interest of these people advocating already in the late 18th century for the end of slavery? There was a recognition that it's an evil, horrible institution that is incompatible with America's experiment in constitutional self-government. And so I think there was a natural tendency to push in this direction. And again, even where slavery existed, there was an understanding that it was problematic. So you have the colonization movement is actually very well represented by elite Southern political leaders, people like James Madison, for instance. Henry Clay are members of this. And so they recognize that slavery is a problem, we need to do something about it, but then we'd have all these formerly enslaved persons, and they're going to be kind of mad, and this might be dangerous. So why don't we end slavery and ship these former slaves off to Africa is a kind of logical sort of thing, and not really taking into account what the enslaved persons might want, but of course completely impractical. I think something like 10,000 enslaved persons were freed and shipped back to Africa throughout the 19th century, during which time the slave population increased by like 500,000, right? So it was just never a realistic possibility. But there is this movement afoot to end slavery. Let's say I mentioned Connecticut already, I mentioned Massachusetts. Yeah, I think probably what I'm going to do is just stop there so we have plenty of time for Q&A. This is setting up, of course, the abolitionist movement, which has begun, let's be clear about this, it's beginning with the Quakers in the mid-18th century. People are agitating, you're getting the formation of abolition societies at the state level, and then it really takes off in the 19th century. We can talk about that if you would like. But at this point, why don't we just turn it over to you all.
Join us in falling in love with America again.